The fog moved like a living thing across the water on the morning the transports turned toward Attu. The decks were rimed with ice, ropes stiff as iron, breath hanging in front of faces already raw from weeks in the Aleutians. Men of the U.S. 7th Infantry Division leaned over the rails and tried to make out the line of shore through the gray. What they saw came and went: scraps of beach, a smear of snow, rock rising into cloud. The sea ran heavy and cold against the hulls, the kind of water that kills the unprepared in minutes. On deck, an officer ran a finger along a folding map that left most of the island blank. Nobody liked how much of it was guesswork. The order came, quiet and certain, to the boats. Operation Landcrab began at first light on May 11, 1943. Landing craft pushed into surf at Massacre Bay and Holtz Bay, while destroyers fired blind into ridges the Navy could barely see. The fog muffled everything until the guns thudded like distant construction. When the ramps slammed down, the men slogged into water that climbed to waists and then chests, rifles held high, packs drinking the sea. They stumbled onto black sand and sucked at air that tasted of salt, smoke, and snow. Beyond the beaches, a mossy tundra, muskeg, waited to swallow boots. It was land, but it moved underfoot like a trap. The Japanese garrison under Colonel Yasuyo Yamasaki had cut dugouts into the ridges and gullies overlooking both bays. They had no tanks, little air support, and short supplies, but they had high ground and patience. Their observers watched the landings through slits covered with brush and glass. The first Americans off the beach met only scattered fire and began to believe the fog had bought them an easy start. Then machine guns opened from above, cold streaks of tracer sliding into men who had nowhere to hide but shallow dents in wet ground. Mortars walked the slopes. Snipers waited for a movement that looked like a leader. There was no road in the way soldiers from the desert or the Carolinas understood roads. A footpath could be 10 yards of slime over woven willow branches, then a frozen patch, then loose rock. The weather shifted in minutes from a blinding white squall to a clear hole in the sky and back again. Wind out of the passes, willywaws, hit hard enough to knock a man over. Clothing meant for California training grounds soaked through and never quite dried. Fingers went numb and stayed that way. More men went down with trench foot and exposure than with bullet wounds in the first days, and medics worked on frozen hands before they worked on rifle shots, because frostbite did not wait. Major General Albert E. Brown pushed his regiments up the fingers of ground at Massacre Bay, while troops at Holtz Bay tried to pinch off the Japanese positions from the north. Maps called features by names the men invented as they bled for them: Fishhook Ridge for its bend around the bay, Buffalo Ridge for a humpbacked rise, Engineer Hill for the units that finally took it. In the fog that lay low every afternoon, a line could drift and an entire platoon vanish from sight at 20 paces. Men called to each other by name to stay located, a practice that made snipers' jobs easier but kept squads intact. When the wind dropped, voices carried across valleys and layered into a steady hum that sounded like a crowded train station. Then a burst of fire would punch a hole in the noise, and the island snapped back into focus. On May 14th, soldiers fighting toward Holtz Bay hit the first serious complex of trenches and caves and found how carefully the enemy had hidden their routes. You could take a bunker and still have fire on your flanks from a tunnel mouth that led behind you. Flamethrowers choked in the wet. Grenades rolled back downhill toward the thrower. The Americans used mortars like chisels, dropping rounds into folds of ground meter by meter to carve a path. They pulled bodies out of the muskeg that left perfect, dark impressions shaped like men. The names of those not yet found went into notebooks that had to be kept dry under shirts. Clothing hardened with ice. Sea rations froze and had to be warmed under armpits. Rifles picked up salt and needed constant attention. The medics' aid stations filled with men whose feet were white and rubbery, who could not feel a pin in a toe or a bootlace against skin. A private from Idaho fell asleep in a snow hollow and woke hours later with his left hand stiff and colorless. He cried when a corpsman rubbed warmth into it. Officers wrote that morale held, but the fog wore on men in ways that did not show in the daily report. Brown was relieved on May 16th and replaced by Major General Eugene Landrum, who pushed the attack even harder. Artillery fired into the mist at coordinates that sometimes turned out to be empty air and sometimes the next ridge over. The 32nd Regiment swung around to threaten the defenders at Holt's Bay from the rear, and by May 17th, the Japanese pulled back, giving up bunkers they had spent a winter improving. They fell south toward the narrow neck of land above Massacre Bay, where Yamasaki planned to concentrate for a last defense. The Americans joined their two beachheads and pushed up into the high ground that dominated the bay. Every ridge they took revealed another, wind-shaved and blunt, with just enough cover for a machine gun team to make it costly. On Engineer Hill, crews dragged 37mm guns by hand through soaking moss to place them where they could look down into ravines. A soldier reaching for a canteen found ice rather than water. Another tried to warm a cup of coffee over a small blue flame and blew on his hands while the steam lifted into the fog and disappeared. On clear moments, aircraft slipped in from ADAC to strafe and bomb, but the weather canceled as many sorties as it allowed. Navy shells walked mountain faces and filled gullies with smoke, but the Japanese were under rock and dirt and waited for the ground to stop shaking before reopening fire. American patrols found caches of rice and a few steel helmets stamped with dates from another war. A single captured soldier told an interpreter that his colonel would lead an attack when all other options closed. The interpreter thought it was bravado. Men in the line heard it and checked their bayonets anyway. Supply was a fight of its own. Amphibious tractors bogged and stalled. Pack mules sank to their bellies in moss and panicked. Men hauled ammunition and food in rubberized bags by rope, step by step. The first hot meal for some companies came after a week ashore. In the field hospital near the beach, surgeons worked in mittens with fingers cut out, rubbing hands together between cases to get feeling back. A machine gun team counted its belt links aloud in the dark to keep track. A chaplain moved between squads with a canvas bag that held a small Bible, cigarettes, and a roll of sulfa powder. By May 26th, the lines tightened around the main Japanese positions above Massacre Bay. The defenders had taken heavy losses, but held enough ridges to make the next push ruinous. Yamasaki assembled what remained of his force, fewer than 1,000 effective men, and saved ammunition. On the American side, men heard bugles and shouted commands drifting in fog and assumed they were hearing things the skull invents when it has not slept. The wind moved and carried smell uphill, smoke, cordite, unwashed wool, and a hint of fish from the sea. Just before dawn on May 29th, Yamasaki launched a banzai charge down the slopes through the mist. It was a hammer blow. The first American positions it struck at the base of Fish Hook Ridge folded in seconds, and the Japanese drove into the rear areas, overrunning a field hospital and killing or wounding everyone inside. Cooks and clerks grabbed rifles and fired from the hip. Engineers smashed open crates of ammunition and threw clips down the line. The fight collapsed into shouting and impact at a range where men could see breath. An enlisted man from Wisconsin wrote later that he smelled the wool of the other man's coat before he saw his face. The attackers reached the very edge of the beach before the weight of numbers and the guns on Engineer Hill cut them down. Yamasaki died leading from the front, as he had promised. When the fog lifted at mid-morning, the slope below the hill was covered with bodies. The battle did not end in a moment of silence. It petered out into small pockets in gullies and holes along the ridge, a last grenade here, a pistol shot there, a single flag removed from a staff and folded by hands, not sure what to do with it next. By nightfall, organized resistance had ended. A total of 28 Japanese soldiers surrendered. The rest were dead or had taken their own lives. American casualties were counted in 3 columns: killed, wounded, and disabled by cold and disease. About 549 Americans were dead and more than 1,000 wounded. Over 2,000 more were treated for trench foot, frostbite, immersion, and infection. The numbers said enough without embroidery. Attu was American soil. That mattered to the men who had clawed over its rocks and to those who kept maps in Washington. It mattered to the Unangan people, evacuated from the Aleutians the year before and living far from their homes. The victory cleared the way for a return to the islands and shut down a route that might have threatened Alaska's coast. It also served as a hard lesson about fighting in places that look empty on a map, but are built to kill the unprepared. The Army rewrote cold weather manuals. Quartermasters demanded better boots. Commanders learned to treat fog like an enemy with a mind of its own. Kiska, the other occupied island, would be found empty when troops stormed ashore in August. The garrison had slipped away under fog without a shot. The men who had fought on Attu heard that news and shook their heads. They still woke at night to the sound of wind battering tent walls and thought of buddies who had stepped into cloud and vanished. A few kept pebbles from Engineer Hill in mess kits, not for luck, but because the weight reminded them of a place where weight fought back. Years later, veterans returned to a landscape that looked almost the same. The fog still rolled over the sea as if pulled by a hand. The muskeg still took a boot heel deeper than expected. On calmer days, the water lay like hammered metal and reflected a sky that could be generous. They walked out to the rusting shell of a landing craft half buried in sand and stood quietly, each man with his own inventory. The names of the fallen were carved into stone thousands of miles away, but some part of each name remained on that wind-cut ground, in the places where a breath turned white and disappeared. Thank you for listening to Last Post History. Subscribe for more true stories from the world at war.